back to On the Middle East, where we engage with thought leaders on the big and interesting developments in the region. Today, we'll be focusing on Iraq, which is rapidly emerging as a new front in the Iran conflict. Some momentous developments have taken place in recent days, with the last US forces pulling out of Iraq's Kurdistan region and Saudi Arabia joining the United States in targeting Iran-backed Shia proxies in a wave of airstrikes across the country. My guest today is Victoria Taylor, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran and Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council. So welcome to our program, Victoria.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to jump in with the biggest news that we were fortunate enough to break last week, that the last US troops were exiting Iraq from Iraqi Kurdistan along with their equipment, notably the Patriots, which obviously are critical, obviously to protect them, but also the Kurds in that capital, Erbil, where they were based. How significant is this? Is this the end of an era, and has the United States once again left Iraq to Iran?
Well, I do feel like it's the end of an era, although it seems that, both in terms of the US drawdown from federal Iraq and the US drawdown from Kurdistan, most of America is not really paying a lot of attention to this. But I do think, as you noted, this is quite significant for Kurdistan and for the Kurdistan regional government. I think the US presence has been important not only practically, as you noted, in providing some degree of protection as it has during this past year of the ups and downs of the Iran war, but it's been very important symbolically as well. And I think for the Kurdistan regional government, the US presence has represented really a symbolic fortification against Baghdad and a protection that the US provided in really protecting Kurdish autonomy. And I think the reality of the US withdrawal from Kurdistan, and the fact that the US consulate is also practically empty, I think is part of a rude awakening that the Kurdish people have really had over the past several years of the Trump administration. This is an administration that has not had that same kind of sense of historical commitment to the Kurds, I think, that the Kurdistan regional government has really been used to.
Absolutely. They are feeling very vulnerable, and many of my Kurdish contacts worry that the consulate won't even reopen. And I'd like to ask you about that. But more broadly, I mean, do you think that this really does expose them to not just attack by Iran, but potentially by federal forces as well going forward, knowing also that this Trump administration seems to fully endorse the reassertion of central government control, be it in Iraq, certainly advocated by Tom Barrack in Syria? Do you think that that's a real risk?
So I think the reality is that even with this US presence that was based in Erbil, it did not halt attacks from either Iran or the militias. And so, I don't think that the US presence has really caused Iran and these Iran-backed militias to think twice about these attacks. But it did provide a measure of protection, and I think there's been a lot of videos where we've seen Patriots and other defensive equipment really shooting drones out of the sky, and so the Kurdistan regional government will be more vulnerable to those kinds of attacks because it does not possess these kinds of counter drone capabilities that the US had present in the region. I don't think right now that a military incursion from the federal government is likely. But I do think that, this administration has not been as involved as previous administrations in really brokering deals between Baghdad and Erbil. And I don't think the Trump administration really views it as a priority to intervene in the same kind of way. And so, certainly, in that situation, the KRG could be more vulnerable to pressure from Baghdad if the US is not willing to really press back against that. And I think one of the unfortunate byproducts of a US government and an administration that's less willing to intervene is that we don't have a Kurdistan regional government, and we're nearing 2 years after the Kurdish parliamentary elections. And I think previous US administrations likely would have been engaging quite actively between the PUK and KDP to really press both sides to form a government. And we've not really seen the Trump administration or Tom Barrack decide that that was an important role for the United States to play.
Well, you've sat in that seat before. You were the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq and Iran, and this infighting between the PUK and KDP is sadly nothing new. And my understanding is that there's a great deal of exasperation within the administration, as there well might have been when you were serving in the administration, with these two parties for failing to, get their acts together. How many years has it been, and they still haven't unified their Peshmerga forces, and they seem to be actively sort of undermining each other. So to what extent do you believe that the Kurds have invited this upon themselves? Some do speculate that perhaps if we had presented a united front, if we could have come across as, rational, functional, constructive partners, perhaps the US would have thought twice about, leaving, though I question that because I think it has a lot more to do with the conduct of the war and the fact that the US is running out of munitions, etc. But I would love to hear your take on that, Victoria.
Well, I do think it's really unfortunate that the infighting between the KDP and PUK is really reaching this high point at a moment when the US administration is not as engaged and supportive of Kurdish issues as previous both Republican and Democratic administrations have been. And I do think a more united efforts, and maybe not even united. I'm not sure that we'll ever really see that kind of unity between the KDP and PUK, but maybe a greater degree of cooperation could have yielded some better outcomes for the Kurds and for the KRG. But I don't think it would have halted the US withdrawal, because I think that obviously this timeline for the end of Operation Inherent Resolve is one that was negotiated under the Biden administration. Um, though it's very clear to me, having been part of those negotiations, the Biden administration did not want to do it. It wanted as long a timeline as possible. And even as it negotiated this timeline, it held out the hope that that timeline could be extended, and if not extended, that the US could maintain a robust military presence in some bilateral capacity. The Trump administration, inherited this timeline, but it was always committed to it. That timeline and the departure of US troops was consistent with something that President Trump really had wanted since his first administration, when he declared the ISIS fight over and was trying to withdraw from Syria. And so this is really, I think, something that was likely inevitable given the president's own wishes, and given, what we see really outlined in this administration's national security strategy. Nevertheless, obviously the US had become very embroiled in Iran, but President Trump has not viewed Iraq as a strategic priority for the United States. He views the 2003 invasion as a mistake, something a lot of Americans really agree with at this point. But he's never had this sense of moral and historical commitment to Iraq And I think that that really held both across federal Iraq and the Kurdistan region. And it was likely inevitable that we were going to reach this point with the U.S. military presence under this team.
But for those of us, or not us, but for people who don't cover Iraq quite as closely as you do, it can appear quite confusing that we have President Trump receiving the new Prime Minister Zaidi like some kind of, hero at the White House. And they hadn't scheduled a lunch yet. They managed to have one. And we heard Trump describing him as, great guy, handsome, all these things and all kinds of pledges made, business deals, etc. And of course, Zaidi, for his part, sort of trying to convince this administration that he would, really be the one to crack down on the corruption, to rein in the militias. Yet, even as he was in Washington, we saw Iran strike down gas facilities in the Iraq Kurdistan region. And then, as reported by my colleague Mustafa Salim in our monitor, they just did this raid on the Shia militia, whose name I always forget, but you'll remind me.
Yeah, Harkat al-Nujaba.
Exactly. And that's sort of turning into some kind of fiasco where the government had to retreat. So you kind of abandon, at least as the Kurds see things, your best ally, the ones who really want you there, who really love you, however dysfunctional they may be, and the ones who, there are lots of them who are very, very hostile to you and pro-Iran. They're the ones you think you can do all the business with. How do you explain that?
I think there's certainly a lot of contradictions across U.S. foreign policy right now. The fact that this, timeline for the departure of U.S. troops was negotiated under Biden under very different circumstances, was never really reevaluated when the Trump team came in. Even, despite the fall of the Assad government in Syria and concerns about, a potential for an ISIS resurgence, the Iran war has also never really prompted a reevaluation about whether a U.S. presence in Iraq would be at all useful or supportive of those efforts. And I think what we see is a U.S. Iraq policy that is a lot more centered on Baghdad. I think an element there that others have written about is, an administration that finds it very easy to deal with strongmen. And I think finds some of the elements of Iraqi democracy to be, very messy, which it is. And so they are, engaging the most actively in Baghdad, really to pursue their interests. I think another element here is really that, both the government in Baghdad and the Trump administration are in alignment about the need for the departure of U.S. troops. And of course, it's not just the Zaidi government, it was the Sudani government as well, and a policy that was really prompted by the Shia coordination framework, and certainly with the great support of the Iranians as well, to finally see the departure of U.S. troops. And I think within this, we see this right now that the Zaidi government has also fixated on the September 30th deadline of the departure of U.S. troops as the deadline for the voluntary disarmament of the militias. And I think in that, there's a real problem there because successive Iraqi leaders, including Prime Minister Sudani, have suggested that, once U.S. troops departed, there would be no reason, no excuse for the militias to exist. But this has never been about the excuse of U.S. troops. This is about the Iranians and the Iranians' interest in maintaining and supporting these militia groups. And that will continue. They will continue to have this reason to exist following the departure of U.S. troops on September 30th.
So can we say that Iran has won in Iraq again?
Well, I think the Iranians and those militias will certainly view this as a victory. This is something that they have long sought. And certainly, I do think that, the departure of U.S. troops, even if the U.S. military has been present in a much smaller number and configuration, does provide, greater opportunity and avenues for the Iranians really to continue, infiltrating the Iraqi security sector.
We do know, of course, that the United States has been actively encouraging Turkey to step in. And we saw Zaidi go to Turkey after his first visit, foreign visit to Washington, then Tehran, go to Ankara, sign some deals, and Ankara actively stepping up, trying to become more influential. Do you think that's going to really fly? And is Turkey the big power that's going to step in to fill the vacuum left by the United States to the extent that we can, speak of one, which I think we can?
Well, so I think, even under Prime Minister Soudani, we'd seen a real warming of relations between Ankara and Baghdad, an effort to really move beyond the PKK issue and the Turkish military presence in Iraq, and to try to forge stronger commercial and economic ties. And also really to address some of the issues that continue to be irritants, including the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, including, water issues. But I think what we see now is really more alignment between Ankara and Washington and foreign policy in the region. And, that has to do not only with the U.S. policy towards Syria, but also just the leadership of U.S. policy towards these countries in the person of Tom Barrack. And so now you certainly have, a lot more connectivity, and a lot more efforts to align U.S. policy, a lot more exchange on U.S. policy between Ankara and Washington, relating to both Syria and Iraq policies now.
And a lot of emphasis, obviously, on the economic side of things in the hope that somehow the Levant can be, sort of a top US partner with Turkey, sort of kind of the partner in that, the,
Yeah, and I
the lead
think
partner in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is I think, certainly a really positive development for Ankara. I think that the Turkish government has for years, viewed U.S. support of the SDF as just a huge irritant in the bilateral relationship. It is long argued that the U.S. should be outsourcing more of its security uh, and counterterrorism fight in Syria to the Turks. And I think, this is a moment where there's a U.S. administration which is much more, I think, willing to entertain that notion.
Which, of course, isn't great for the Kurds because until recently, certainly, the Kurdistan region and particularly the KDP, and even more particularly President Nechervan Barzani, used to be the big friend, right? And of course, in Syria, we've seen the Kurds take a big hit with the withdrawal of US troops from there and the downgrading of the relationship with the SDF, which will soon be dissolved, I imagine. But to get back to the Kurds doing it to themselves a bit, how effective, and this is my final question, Victoria, do you think they are in Washington as,
Yeah.
advancing their own agenda with the lobbies that they work with?
Right. Well, I think what we're seeing in Washington is really a symptom of the broader dispute between the KDP and PUK, and they're operating separately in Washington, and they're advocating for their interests separately in Baghdad. And unfortunately, I think that has undermined broader Kurdish interests because they are not fully aligned. And at times, the arguments that they're making in Washington are really more rooted in the internal disputes than they are about the broader Kurdish agenda. And I think, this is a moment where we could have really benefited from having, senior Kurdish leaders from both parties really make the case for broader Kurdish interests, not just KDP or PUK interests, but the interests of the Kurdish people more broadly, across the region. And unfortunately, that's not what happened here. And, I think that historical memory of, the U.S. support for Operation Provide Comfort, of, the strong Peshmerga fight against ISIS, unfortunately is not remembered across Washington. And I hope that, Kurdish leaders of both parties will really make a more concerted effort to remind policymakers here of why Kurdistan and the Kurdish people remain, the strongest allies of Washington within Iraq, and that having a semi-autonomous region that's supportive of U.S. interest does advance our broader interests in Iraq and the region.
Here, here. Well, Victoria, thank you so much for joining us here today.
And thanks for the conversation, Ambreen.
And that's it for today. For more in-depth and independent reporting on the Middle East, go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.